2,000 years ago, in a world ruled by empires, fear, and rigid religious laws, a carpenter from a small town began speaking words that would quietly, yet permanently, change human history. He didn't command armies. He didn't write books. He didn't sit on a throne. Yet today, billions of lives across cultures, nations, and centuries are shaped by his teachings. His name was Jesus of Nazareth. What made Jesus different wasn't just what he taught, but how and why he taught it. In an age where power meant domination, Jesus spoke about humility. In a society obsessed with status, he lifted up the poor, the broken, and the forgotten. While the world said, "Protect yourself," Jesus said, "Love your enemy." Those words didn't just challenge people, they disrupted the very operating system of human thinking. Jesus didn't start with complex theology. He started with the human heart. He talked about forgiveness when revenge felt natural. He talked about mercy when punishment felt justified. He talked about love not as a feeling, but as a radical choice. To love God, to love others, and most shockingly, to love those who hurt you. Crowds followed him not because he promised comfort, but because he spoke truth with authority and compassion at the same time. Farmers, fishermen, tax collectors, outcasts, and even skeptics felt something different when he spoke. His teachings were simple enough for a child to understand, yet deep enough to challenge philosophers and kings. Jesus used stories, parables, to bypass defenses and speak directly to the soul. A lost sheep, a prodigal son, a good Samaritan. These weren't just stories. They were mirrors, forcing people to see themselves, their prejudices, and their choices. And often, they didn't like what they saw. What's remarkable is that Jesus didn't ask people to merely admire his teachings. He asked them to live them, to forgive 70 times 7, to turn the other cheek, to serve instead of dominate, to lose their life in order to truly find it. These ideas were not safe. They were revolutionary, and that's why, from the very beginning, his teachings divided people. Some were transformed, others were threatened. Because when you tell people that love is stronger than power and truth is stronger than fear, the world doesn't stay the same. This series is about those teachings, the words that outlived empires, reshaped morality, and continue to challenge us today. And it begins with one simple but dangerous idea. Jesus placed at the center of everything love that costs you something. Love your enemy, the most dangerous idea ever spoken. If there is one teaching of Jesus that still makes people uncomfortable, even today, it is this: love your enemies, not tolerate them, not ignore them, not secretly hope they fail. Love them. When Jesus spoke these words, they didn't sound poetic or symbolic, they sounded impossible. In the ancient world, survival depended on loyalty to your tribe and strength against your rivals. Enemies were a threat, not a lesson. They were to be defeated, humiliated, or destroyed. But Jesus took this deeply human instinct and flipped it upside down. He told people that responding to hate with hate only multiplies darkness. Love, he said, is the only force strong enough to break the cycle. This wasn't a soft teaching. It was a dangerous one. Loving your enemy meant refusing revenge when revenge felt justified. It meant praying for those who abused you. It meant choosing compassion when anger felt righteous. Jesus wasn't asking people to deny pain, he was asking them to refuse becoming shaped by it. What made this teaching even more radical was that Jesus lived it. When he was mocked, beaten, and publicly executed, he didn't call for fire from heaven. He didn't curse his enemies. Instead, he spoke words that still echo through history. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In that moment, love stopped being an idea and became a lived example. This teaching changed how people understood power. Real strength, Jesus taught, is not found in dominance, but in restraint. Not in crushing your enemy, but in refusing to let hatred control you. That kind of love doesn't make you weak, it makes you free. Across history, this idea has shaped movements that changed the world. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. drew directly from Jesus' command to love enemies when confronting injustice. The belief that moral courage can defeat violence has its roots here in the teachings of a man who refused to fight back with the world's weapons. Yet this teaching remains one of the hardest to follow. It exposes our desire for control, revenge, and moral superiority. It asks us to see enemies not as monsters, but as broken humans. That doesn't excuse wrongdoing, but it refuses to let wrongdoing define our response. Jesus knew this teaching would be resisted. He never said it would be easy. He said it would be right. And 2,000 years later, a world still driven by conflict continues to wrestle with this uncomfortable truth. Hate may feel powerful in the moment, but only love has the power to truly end a war. The upside-down kingdom, when the last came first. In a world obsessed with rank, wealth, and recognition, Jesus introduced a vision so radical that it sounded almost absurd. The last will be first, and the first will be last. These words weren't motivational slogans. They were a direct challenge to how societies had always been built and still are. In the time of Jesus, social order was clear and rigid. The rich were seen as blessed. The powerful were respected. The poor were invisible. Religious leaders sat at the top, while sinners and outcasts lived at the margins. Success meant climbing higher than others. But Jesus stepped into this structure and turned it completely upside down. He didn't praise ambition. He praised humility. He didn't celebrate those who demanded attention. He lifted up those who served quietly. When his disciples argued about who among them was the greatest, Jesus didn't give them a ranking. Instead, he placed a child in front of them and said that greatness looks like this: trusting, humble, and dependent. This teaching redefined leadership forever. Jesus said that anyone who wants to be first must become a servant, not a ruler who controls, but a leader who carries the weight of others. This idea was shocking, especially coming from someone people believed could be a king. Yet Jesus consistently refused status and power. He washed his disciples' feet, an act reserved for servants, and told them to do the same for one another. The message was clear. Value doesn't come from position. It comes from purpose. In the kingdom Jesus described, people aren't measured by how many serve them, but by how many they serve. That concept reshaped families, communities, and eventually entire cultures. This teaching also brought hope to those pushed aside by society. The poor, the sick, the broken, and the rejected suddenly mattered. Jesus didn't just talk to them, he ate with them, touched them, and restored their dignity. For the first time, the people at the bottom heard that they were seen, loved, and honored by God. But for those at the top, this teaching felt threatening. If the last could be first, then power was no longer guaranteed. Pride had no place in this new way of life, and that made many uncomfortable. Even today, the world still struggles with this idea. We chase influence, applause, and visibility. Yet Jesus' words continue to whisper and sometimes shout that real greatness is found in humility, service, and love. The illusion of wealth. Why Jesus said riches can blind the soul. In every generation, wealth has promised security, power, and freedom. People believe money will protect them from fear and guarantee their future. But Jesus spoke about wealth in a way that unsettled almost everyone who heard him. He warned that riches, instead of saving the soul, can quietly imprison it. Jesus didn't condemn money itself. What he challenged was the illusion that wealth equals worth. He watched how the rich were admired and the poor ignored, and he exposed a dangerous lie hiding beneath it all, that what you own defines who you are. According to Jesus, that belief slowly blinds the heart. One of his most shocking statements was this: "It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God." People were stunned. In their culture, wealth was often seen as proof of God's favor. Jesus shattered that assumption in a single sentence. He wasn't saying the wealthy were hopeless, he was saying dependence on riches makes dependence on God nearly impossible. Jesus told stories to make his point unavoidable. A rich man who built bigger barns to store his abundance, convinced he had secured his future, only to lose his life that very night. His wealth couldn't buy him one more breath. The lesson was simple and brutal. You can be financially successful and spiritually bankrupt at the same time. He also contrasted wealth with generosity. Jesus praised a poor widow who gave to small coins everything she had, while wealthy donors gave large amounts without sacrifice. In his eyes, her offering was greater because it came from trust, not excess. True wealth, Jesus taught, is measured by the heart, not the account balance. This teaching challenged greed, but it also offered freedom. Jesus invited people to stop living in fear of losing what they owned. He taught that life is more than possessions, and security is more than savings. When you stop worshiping wealth, you stop being controlled by it. Even today, these words hit close to home. Modern culture constantly tells us we are one purchase away from happiness. Jesus tells us we are one act of generosity away from freedom. He didn't promise luxury, he promised meaning. By redefining wealth, Jesus reshaped how people thought about success, contentment, and purpose. His message wasn't about poverty, it was about priority. What comes first in your life? Clean on the outside, empty on the inside. Few teachings of Jesus were as confrontational as his words to the religious elite. These were people who followed the rules, knew the scriptures, and appeared morally flawless. Yet, Jesus looked past their polished behavior and exposed a dangerous contradiction. Outward religion without inward change. Jesus didn't attack faith. He attacked hypocrisy. He saw how religion was being used as a performance, a way to gain respect, power, and moral superiority. People prayed loudly, fasted publicly, and followed rituals perfectly, yet their hearts remained untouched by compassion, humility, or love. To Jesus, this was not righteousness. It was emptiness. He compared such people to whitewashed tombs, beautiful on the outside, but full of decay within. The imagery was shocking and intentional. Jesus wanted people to understand that looking holy means nothing if the heart is corrupt. True faith, he taught, begins internally and then reshapes how you live, love, and treat others. This teaching challenged the idea that rules alone could make someone good. Jesus didn't lower moral standards, he raised them. He said anger is the seed of murder, lust the seed of adultery, and pride the root of countless sins. By doing this, he moved morality from behavior to intention. It wasn't enough to avoid wrongdoing. One had to confront the heart behind it. For ordinary people, this teaching was liberating. They no longer had to pretend or perform to be accepted by God. Jesus welcomed the broken, the confused, and the repentant. He ate with sinners, not to approve of their choices, but to restore their dignity and invite transformation. For the religious authorities, however, this was deeply threatening. Their power depended on appearances. If God cared more about their heart than the ritual, their control weakened. Jesus' words stripped away their masks and exposed fear, pride, and insecurity hiding behind sacred titles. Even today, this teaching remains uncomfortable. It forces us to ask hard questions. Are we living out of conviction or image? Do we love people or just judge them? Are our values shaping our actions, or are our actions just a performance? Jesus made it clear. Transformation doesn't start in temples or traditions. It starts in the heart. When the inside changes, the outside follows naturally. Come as you are. Why Jesus invited the weary, not the perfect. One of the most comforting and world-changing invitations Jesus ever gave was simple, honest, and deeply human. Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He didn't call the strong. He didn't summon the flawless. He called the tired, the overwhelmed, and the broken. In a world where worth was measured by obedience, productivity, and religious performance, this invitation felt revolutionary. People were exhausted by rules they could never fully keep, by guilt they couldn't escape, and by a life that demanded more than it gave. Jesus looked at that exhaustion and didn't shame it. He acknowledged it. Jesus understood that many people weren't rejecting God, they were drowning under the weight of expectations placed on them in God's name. Religious leaders had turned faith into a heavy burden, stacking laws on top of laws, leaving people crushed rather than healed. Jesus directly confronted this, saying his yoke was easy and his burden was light. What made this teaching so powerful was its honesty. Jesus didn't promise a life without struggle. He promised rest within the struggle, not escape from responsibility, but freedom from fear, shame, and constant self-justification. He offered a relationship, not a checklist. Again and again, Jesus moved toward those society avoided: the sick, the grieving, the sinful, the doubting, He didn't demand they fix themselves before approaching him. Healing came after acceptance, not before it. This reversed the entire moral logic of the time. This teaching reshaped how people understood grace. Grace wasn't a reward for good behavior. It was the starting point for transformation. When people felt seen, forgiven, and loved, their lives began to change naturally. Shame lost its power. Hope took its place. Even today, this invitation speaks to a burned-out world. People are still exhausted emotionally, spiritually, and mentally. We chase approval, success, and perfection, yet feel emptier than ever. Jesus' words cut through that noise. Rest isn't found in achieving more, but in trusting more. This doesn't mean complacency. It means letting go of the lie that you must earn your worth. Jesus taught that value comes before effort, not after it. And when people finally believe that, they don't become lazy, they become free. Fear not, the courage to trust in an uncertain world. Few phrases appear in the teachings of Jesus as often and as urgently as this one. Do not be afraid. He said it to frightened disciples, anxious crowds, and grieving hearts. Not because danger didn't exist, but because fear, left unchecked, has the power to control and shrink a human life. The world Jesus lived in was unstable and harsh. People feared illness, poverty, violence, and political oppression. There was no safety net, no modern medicine, and no guarantee of tomorrow. Yet into that fragile reality, Jesus spoke about trust not as blind optimism, but as grounded confidence in God's care. Jesus directly addressed anxiety when he talked about daily needs. He told people not to worry endlessly about food, clothing, or the future. He pointed to birds that don't store up wealth and flowers that don't labor, yet still thrive. His message wasn't anti-work, it was anti-obsession. Worry, he taught, doesn't add a single hour to life, it only steals the present moment. This teaching confronted fear at its root, the belief that we are alone and must control everything to survive. Jesus offered a different vision, one where trust replaces panic, and faith steadies the heart even when outcomes are uncertain. That kind of trust doesn't deny reality. It reshapes how we face it. Jesus also modeled courage. He calmed storms, walked into hostile crowds, and continued teaching despite constant threats. When his disciples panicked during a violent storm at sea, he asked a piercing question. Why are you so afraid? It wasn't condemnation, it was invitation. An invitation to see that fear doesn't have to be the loudest voice in the room. This teaching transformed how people understood security. Safety wasn't found in controlling circumstances, but in trusting a presence greater than them. That idea gave ordinary people extraordinary courage. They could face hardship without being defined by it. In modern life, fear still dominates headlines and decisions. Fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of the unknown. Jesus' words remain unsettling and comforting at the same time. Fear is natural, but it doesn't have to rule you. Courage, according to Jesus, isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing trust in spite of it. And that choice changes everything. Lose to win, the paradox that redefined life. Among all the teachings of Jesus, few sound as contradictory and as unsettling as this one. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. At first glance, it feels backward, even dangerous. Why would losing anything lead to gain? Yet this paradox sits at the very center of Jesus' message. Jesus understood something timeless about the human condition. The more desperately we cling to control, comfort, and self-preservation, the smaller our lives become. People spend years protecting their image, their status, and their safety, only to wake up feeling empty. Jesus exposed that trap with brutal honesty. He wasn't calling people to self-destruction. He was calling them to self-surrender. There's a difference. Losing your life in Jesus' teaching meant letting go of the false self the ego built on fear, pride, and constant self-interest. Only then, he said, could someone discover their true self. This teaching challenged the culture of self-promotion, even in ancient times. Honor, reputation, and survival were everything. Jesus said real life begins when you stop making yourself the center of the universe. That idea cut against instinct and social norms, but it carried deep freedom. Jesus lived this paradox openly. He refused political power, avoided fame when crowds grew too large, and ultimately gave his life rather than protect it. In doing so, he demonstrated that meaning doesn't come from preserving yourself at all costs, but from pouring yourself out for something greater. This teaching reshaped how people thought about success. Success was no longer measured by how much you accumulated or protected, but by how much you were willing to give. Love required risk, faith required release, and purpose required sacrifice. Even today, this teaching feels uncomfortable. Modern culture tells us to build our brand, defend our identity, and secure our future. Jesus tells us that clinging tightly to any of that can cost us the very life we're trying to protect. Paradoxically, those who live for something beyond themselves often experience the deepest joy and fulfillment. When fear loosens its grip, life expands. When ego steps aside, purpose steps in. Jesus didn't offer an easy path, but he offered a meaningful one. Lose your life, he said, and you'll finally discover what life truly is. Forgiveness or chains, the freedom hidden in letting go. Few teachings of Jesus cut as close to the heart and resist our instincts as his command to forgive, not once, not when it feels deserved, but again and again. Jesus understood something most people learn the hard way. Unforgiveness doesn't punish the offender. It imprisons the one who holds it. In Jesus' time, justice was often personal and public. Wrongs demanded repayment. Honor required retaliation. But Jesus introduced a radically different logic. He taught that forgiveness is not weakness. It is release. When asked how many times one should forgive, he answered, 70 times 7, not a number to be calculated, but a mindset without limits. This teaching didn't ignore injustice. Jesus never denied that harm causes real pain. Instead, he addressed what happens after the harm, what bitterness does to the soul. Unforgiveness, he taught, keeps wounds open. It allows the past to control the present. Jesus illustrated this through stories. In one parable, a servant forgiven an enormous debt refuses to forgive a smaller one. The message was clear. Receiving mercy while refusing to give it creates inner contradiction. Forgiveness, in Jesus' view, is a flow. When it stops moving outward, it poisons the heart. What makes this teaching so difficult is that forgiveness feels unfair. It feels like letting someone off the hook. But Jesus reframed forgiveness as a gift you give yourself. It breaks the emotional chains that tie you to the offense. It doesn't erase consequences, but it releases control. Jesus didn't just teach forgiveness, he practiced it at the highest cost. From the cross, in unbearable pain, he forgave those responsible for his suffering. This moment wasn't symbolic. It was the ultimate proof that forgiveness has power even in the darkest circumstances. Across history, this teaching has transformed lives and communities. Forgiveness has ended cycles of violence, healed families, and restored broken relationships. It doesn't happen instantly. It often requires time, honesty, and courage. But according to Jesus, it is the only path that leads to peace. In a world that profits from outrage and resentment, forgiveness feels almost rebellious. Yet Jesus insisted it was essential. Not forgiving keeps you tied to the past. Forgiving sets you free to move forward. The blind spot of judgment, seeing others clearly, starts with yourself. Human beings are quick to notice flaws in others and slow to confront their own. Jesus addressed this tendency with striking clarity, warning that judgment often reveals more about the judge than the one being judged. His words cut through moral arrogance and exposed a hidden blind spot in the human heart. Jesus famously asked, "Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own?" The image was intentionally exaggerated, almost humorous, but the message was serious. Judgment distorts vision. It magnifies the faults of others while minimizing our own. This teaching wasn't a call to ignore right and wrong. Jesus didn't promote moral indifference. What he challenged was the posture of superiority, the assumption that one stands above others as a moral referee. When people judge from that position, compassion disappears and hypocrisy grows. Jesus observed that judgment often serves as a shield. By focusing on others' failures, people avoid confronting their own insecurity, guilt, or fear. It's easier to condemn than to reflect. But self-righteous judgment, Jesus warned, builds walls rather than healing wounds. He demonstrated this teaching through action. When a woman caught in wrongdoing was dragged before him, her accusers demanded punishment. Jesus didn't deny the seriousness of her actions, but he shifted the focus back to the crowd. Let the one without sin cast the first stone. One by one, they left. The stones fell, not because sin didn't matter, but because self-awareness finally did. This moment revealed the heart of Jesus' teaching. Truth and mercy are not enemies. Accountability without humility becomes cruelty. Mercy without truth becomes meaningless. Jesus held both together. Even today, judgment dominates conversations online, in families, and in communities. People label, cancel, and condemn, often without understanding context or complexity. Jesus' words remain a challenge. Before pointing outward, look inward. This teaching frees people from the exhausting role of moral police. When humility replaces judgment, relationships soften, conversations open, growth becomes possible. Jesus didn't ask people to ignore brokenness. He asked them to start with their own. Because when you see yourself clearly, You learn how to see others with patience, honesty, and grace. When prayer became personal, from performance to presence, in Jesus' time, prayer was often public, loud, and carefully performed. Religious leaders prayed in visible places, using polished words to impress both God and people. But Jesus challenged this entire approach. He taught that prayer was never meant to be a performance. It was meant to be a relationship. Jesus warned against praying to be seen, not because public prayer was wrong, but because motive mattered. When prayer becomes a tool for image, it loses its power. Jesus said that those who pray for attention already receive their reward the approval of others, but miss the deeper connection they were meant to experience. Instead, he invited people into something radically intimate. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. This wasn't about location. It was about honesty. Jesus was telling people that God is not impressed by words, length, or volume. God responds to sincerity. He then offered a simple model for prayer, what later became known as the Lord's Prayer. It wasn't filled with complex language or theological jargon. It began with relationship. Our Father, not distant, not detached, personal, close. The prayer focused on daily needs, forgiveness, and guidance, revealing that nothing in human life is too small or too broken to bring before God. This teaching transformed how people understood access to God. No special status was required. No religious gatekeepers stood in the way. Prayer became something anyone could do, anywhere, at any time. That idea alone reshaped spiritual life across the world. Jesus also taught persistence in prayer, but not manipulation. He wasn't encouraging people to wear God down. He was building trust. Prayer, he showed, doesn't change God's character, it changes the one who prays. It aligns the heart with wisdom, patience, and hope. Even today, many struggle with prayer. They worry about saying the wrong words or not praying enough. Jesus removed that pressure. He taught that prayer is simply presence, bringing your real self before God, without masks or scripts. This teaching freed people from religious anxiety. Prayer was no longer about getting it right. It was about being real. No love for God without love for people. When asked to identify the greatest commandment, Jesus didn't hesitate. He said loving God with everything you are and loving your neighbor as yourself were not two separate ideas. They were inseparable. According to Jesus, you cannot truly love God while ignoring the people around you. This teaching was deeply unsettling. Many believed devotion to God was proven through rituals, sacrifices, and strict rule-keeping. Jesus stripped all of that down to one uncomfortable truth. The authenticity of your faith is revealed in how you treat others. To explain who a neighbor really is, Jesus told one of his most famous stories, the parable of the Good Samaritan. In the story, a wounded man is ignored by religious leaders who pass by without helping. The hero is a Samaritan, someone considered an enemy and outsider. By choosing this character, Jesus shattered ethnic, religious, and social boundaries. The message was impossible to miss. Love is not defined by proximity or similarity. It is defined by action. Compassion that stays theoretical is not compassion at all. Love, in Jesus' teaching, requires inconvenience, risk, and generosity. This teaching changed moral responsibility. People could no longer hide behind beliefs while neglecting suffering. Feeding the hungry, caring for the sick, and standing with the oppressed became acts of worship. Jesus made it clear that love for God expresses itself through love for people, especially the vulnerable. Even today, this teaching challenges selective compassion. It asks hard questions. Who do we avoid? Who do we label as not our problem? Jesus' answer is consistent and uncomfortable. If someone is in need, they are your neighbor. Jesus lived this message daily. He touched the untouchable, spoke with the rejected, and welcomed those society pushed away. His love crossed lines others refused to cross. This teaching reshaped communities and inspired movements of charity, justice, and service around the world. Hospitals, shelters, and humanitarian efforts trace their roots back to this simple but demanding idea. Loving God, Jesus taught, is not proven by words spoken in sacred spaces. It's proven by love lived out in ordinary moments. The rise of the humble. Why Jesus said the lowly win. In a world driven by competition and self-promotion, humility is often misunderstood as weakness. But Jesus taught the exact opposite. He said that those who humble themselves will be exalted, and those who exalt themselves will be humbled. This wasn't a poetic metaphor, it was a fundamental redefinition of greatness. Jesus watched how people sought honor, the best seats, and public recognition. He saw how ego shaped behavior, even in religious spaces. Instead of condemning ambition outright, he exposed its danger. When the need to be seen becomes central, character quietly erodes. Humility, according to Jesus, is not thinking less of yourself, it's thinking of yourself less. It's freedom from the exhausting need to prove worth. Jesus himself embodied this teaching. Though revered by crowds, he avoided titles, washed feet, and chose service over status. His authority didn't come from position. It came from integrity. This teaching challenged cultural norms. In ancient societies, honor determined value. Shame meant exclusion. Jesus flipped this system by honoring the overlooked and warning the proud. He praised the quiet, faith of the unseen rather than the loud, confidence of the powerful. One of Jesus' most striking stories involved two men praying, one proudly listing his virtues, the other humbly admitting his failures. Jesus said it was the humble one who left justified. The lesson was clear. Self-awareness opens the door to growth. Self-righteousness slams it shut. Humility also reshaped relationships. When people stop competing for superiority, they start listening. When pride loosens its grip, empathy takes its place. Jesus taught that humility doesn't diminish influence, it deepens it. Even today, humility remains countercultural. Social platforms reward self-promotion. Leadership often equates to control. Yet history consistently shows that the most transformative leaders are those grounded in humility. Their strength lies in restraint, their influence in trust. Jesus didn't promise that humility would bring applause. He promised it would bring meaning. In his upside-down kingdom, lifting others lifts you. Serving others elevates you. Small faith, unstoppable power, the strength of a mustard seed. Jesus often used ordinary images to reveal extraordinary truths. One of the most powerful was also one of the smallest. He said that faith the size of a mustard seed, one of the tiniest seeds known in his culture, could move mountains. The statement sounded unbelievable, yet its meaning was deeply practical. Jesus wasn't glorifying big faith. He was exposing the myth that faith must be impressive to be effective. People often assume that confidence, certainty, and spiritual intensity are what make faith powerful. Jesus taught the opposite. What matters is not the size of faith, but the direction of it. This teaching brought hope to ordinary people who felt spiritually inadequate. They didn't need perfect belief or unshakable confidence. Even fragile, trembling faith mattered. Jesus showed that doubt doesn't disqualify faith, it often accompanies it. Throughout his ministry, Jesus responded to small, imperfect faith. A desperate parent asking for help, a fearful disciple stepping onto water, a woman reaching out in quiet hope. None of them had flawless belief, yet Jesus honored their trust, however incomplete it was. This teaching also challenged pride. If mountains move because of God's power, not human certainty, then faith can't become a badge of superiority. It becomes an act of dependence. Jesus consistently redirected attention away from human ability and toward divine faithfulness. The mustard seed image carried another layer. Though small, the seed grows into something far larger than expected. Faith, Jesus taught, works the same way. What begins as a simple step of trust can grow into courage, resilience, and transformation over time. Even today, people hesitate because they feel their faith isn't enough. Jesus' words still speak clearly. You don't need more faith, you need to use the faith you already have. Growth follows action. This teaching reshaped spiritual confidence. Faith was no longer reserved for the spiritually elite. It was accessible to anyone willing to trust, even imperfectly. Jesus didn't minimize doubt. He met people inside it, and in doing so, he revealed that faith is not about certainty, it's about relationship. More than words, the power of doing, not just hearing. Jesus repeatedly made a startling claim. Hearing his teachings was not enough. To truly enter the life he promised, people had to act on what they heard. Everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock, he said. The emphasis was clear. Faith without action is fragile, unstable, and easily washed away by life's storms. In a world overflowing with advice, tradition, and instruction, this teaching was revolutionary. Many believed knowledge alone was sufficient. If you studied scripture, memorized prayers, and followed rules, you were secure. Jesus rejected that notion. True transformation requires living the principles, not just reciting them. He illustrated this with striking examples. One man prayed, fasted, and appeared righteous but in secret. He judged others harshly and refused to help the needy. Another quietly served the poor, forgave constantly, and acted with compassion. Jesus made it clear the second person, not the first, had built on the rock. This teaching challenged the human tendency to separate intention from action. It's easy to admire good ideas, agree with inspiring words, or feel moved by speeches. Yet without application, these ideas remain powerless. Jesus demanded integration. What we say must align with what we do. He also reframed responsibility. People could no longer blame circumstances, heritage, or tradition for spiritual failure. Choice is matter. Decisions matter. Every act of obedience strengthens the foundation, and every ignored teaching leaves the soul vulnerable. Even today, this lesson is urgent. Life throws storms, disappointment, loss, betrayal, and chaos. Words alone cannot anchor a person. Only a life actively built on principles of love, humility, forgiveness, and faith endures. Knowledge without practice becomes fragile. Doing without understanding becomes reckless. Jesus demanded both. By emphasizing action, Jesus transformed moral expectation into lived reality. Religion without deeds is empty. Ethics without commitment is fragile. Faith without obedience is unstable. His challenge remains timeless. Don't just admire the truth, live it. Serving to lead, the hidden path to true greatness. In the eyes of the world, greatness is measured by power, wealth, and influence. Kings, generals, and CEOs are often celebrated because they command attention, resources, or armies. But Jesus introduced a completely different standard. Whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. In his teaching, leadership is not about being served, it's about serving. This was revolutionary. In a society obsessed with status, seating arrangements, and public recognition, Jesus flipped the script. Humility and service, not ambition and dominance, became the true markers of influence. The message was simple but unsettling. The path to authority doesn't begin with control. It begins with selfless action. Jesus modeled this himself in ways that stunned his followers. One of the most striking examples is when he washed the feet of his disciples. In that culture, foot washing was a task reserved for the lowest servant. By performing it, Jesus didn't just demonstrate humility, he redefined leadership itself. Leadership, he showed, is not a title or privilege. It is a responsibility to care for others. He extended this lesson beyond symbolic acts, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, comforting the broken. These were the arenas where greatness was proven. Influence in Jesus' world was measured by the impact on others, not by applause or recognition. True leaders lift others up rather than elevate themselves. This teaching also challenged pride. People naturally seek positions of authority to prove worth. Jesus warned that power sought for personal gain ultimately leads to emptiness. Conversely, those who serve without expecting reward cultivate respect, trust, and authentic influence. Even today, this lesson remains countercultural. Modern society still equates leadership with control, visibility, or dominance. Yet the most enduring leaders, social reformers, community builders, mentors, and visionaries often follow Jesus' principle. They serve first, and their service creates lasting impact. By connecting greatness to service, Jesus reshaped how people thought about ambition, responsibility, and legacy. The highest seat is not reserved for the loudest voice, the strongest arm, or the wealthiest hand. It belongs to the one who lifts the heaviest burdens of others. Paradox of giving, abundance through generosity. In a world where scarcity often drives fear, hoarding, and self-preservation, Jesus offered a teaching that seemed radical. It is more blessed to give than to receive. At first glance, it sounds counterintuitive. Why would giving, often at personal cost, lead to blessing? Yet in Jesus' vision, generosity is not a financial transaction, it is a transformation of the heart. Jesus observed that most people operate under a scarcity mindset, believing resources are limited and survival depends on holding tightly to what they have. This mindset fosters anxiety, competition, and distrust. By contrast, giving creates a flow of resources, of trust, and of life itself. Generosity signals faith that life is not about accumulation, but about circulation. He illustrated this principle through simple, tangible acts: feeding the hungry, sharing meals, helping the needy, and giving without expectation of return. All of these were examples of practical generosity. These actions, Jesus taught, are seeds. Even the smallest act of giving can produce unforeseen growth, blessing, and change. One of his most striking lessons came when he observed a poor widow placing too small coins into the temple offering. Compared to the rich donors, her gift was tiny, but she gave everything she had. Jesus praised her not for the size of the gift, but for the trust and sacrifice behind it. Generosity, he emphasized, is measured not by quantity, but by commitment and heart. This teaching challenged human assumptions about power and security. People assume wealth and resources are for self-preservation. Jesus reframed it. Abundance is unlocked when we stop clinging and start sharing. Giving breaks the chains of fear and opens the door to freedom, joy, and divine blessing. Even today, this lesson remains countercultural. Modern culture often equates security with accumulation and success with possessions. Yet studies, stories, and lived experience confirm what Jesus taught. Generosity creates lasting impact, builds connection, and fosters inner fulfillment. By linking blessing to giving, Jesus redefined prosperity. Life is not measured by what we store, but by what we share. He transformed giving from an obligation into a spiritual principle, showing that generosity is both a reflection of faith and a pathway to freedom. Mercy over judgment, the law of compassion. In a world obsessed with rules, punishment, and moral perfection, Jesus introduced a radical principle. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. To him, mercy was not optional, it was the ultimate law. While society celebrated strict adherence to rules, Jesus emphasized compassion as the true measure of righteousness. This teaching directly challenged the rigid legalism of his time. Religious leaders focused on external compliance, tithes, rituals, and ceremonies. But Jesus exposed a deeper truth. Obedience without compassion is hollow. Laws are not ends in themselves. They exist to protect life, dignity, and community. When they become instruments of condemnation rather than restoration, they lose their purpose. Jesus illustrated this principle through stories and interactions. A woman caught in adultery, a tax collector despised by society, a Samaritan showing kindness to a stranger. These were not just moral lessons. They were demonstrations of a kingdom where mercy governs human action. Compassion, he showed, is more powerful than punishment. Mercy restores, heals, and transforms where judgment only divides and condemns. He also emphasized the reciprocity of mercy. Those who extend compassion are themselves recipients of grace. This principle disrupts the natural human tendency toward retaliation. It invites people to break cycles of blame, anger, and resentment. By choosing mercy, Jesus taught, we align ourselves with a higher, enduring justice. This teaching unsettled his contemporaries because mercy cannot be controlled or measured like obedience. It demands vulnerability, sacrifice, and humility. It asks people to see beyond their own perspective, to enter into the suffering of others, and to act with courage where it is easier to judge. Even today, this teaching challenges modern sensibilities. Legal systems, workplaces, and communities often prioritize rules over humanity. Yet lasting transformation comes not from condemnation, but from understanding, empathy, and mercy. Those who forgive, care, and act with kindness wield a quiet but unstoppable power. Jesus' message was clear. The heart matters more than the letter of the law. Compassion is not weakness, it is strength. Mercy is not a compromise, it is a revolution. In choosing mercy over judgment, humanity glimpses the character of God and the way of true life. Treasures beyond this world. Why earthly wealth fades. In a society obsessed with accumulation, status, and material security, Jesus spoke a truth that startled his listeners. Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal, but store up treasures in heaven. This teaching wasn't about rejecting work, money, or comfort. It was about reorienting the human heart toward what truly lasts. Jesus understood the fragility of earthly wealth. Money, possessions, and status can be stolen, decay, or lose meaning. People often invest their lives in what cannot endure, chasing security and satisfaction that remain forever fleeting. He challenged this mindset by pointing to a treasure that is eternal, the value of character, compassion, generosity, and faithfulness. This teaching also reshaped priorities. Life, according to Jesus, is not measured by what you own, but by how you live, serve, and love. Investing in the well-being of others, nurturing relationships, acting with integrity, and cultivating spiritual depth are the treasures that endure. Earthly wealth can vanish overnight. Spiritual wealth builds a foundation no storm can destroy. Jesus illustrated this principle through parables. A man hoards grain and builds bigger barns, only to lose his life before he can enjoy it. Another invests in kindness, generosity, and God's purposes, and discovers fulfillment far beyond material gain. The contrast is clear. Earthly security is temporary. Spiritual richness is eternal. This teaching challenges human instinct. People naturally measure success by what is visible and quantifiable. Bank accounts, property, titles, and influence. Jesus flips this perspective, asking people to consider invisible yet enduring realities. What lasts is what aligns with God's values, not what impresses society. Even today, this principle remains countercultural. Consumerism, competition, and social comparison dominate culture. Yet Jesus' words remind us that fulfillment does not come from accumulation, but from alignment with eternal principles. Giving, serving, loving, forgiving, these are the investments that yield true returns. By focusing on eternal treasures, Jesus frees people from the anxiety of constant comparison and desire. Life is no longer about hoarding, but about participating in something larger, lasting, and meaningful. The world's fleeting wealth pales in comparison to the treasure stored in hearts, shaped by love, mercy, and faith. The call to follow a life fully surrendered, fully alive. Every teaching of Jesus leads to a single, undeniable invitation: follow me. It is not a suggestion, a theory, or an abstract idea. It is a call to action, a challenge to surrender the familiar, the comfortable, and the self-centered, and to embrace a life fully alive in purpose, love, and truth. To follow Jesus is to step into a world turned upside down. It means choosing humility over pride, mercy over judgment, generosity over greed, and service over self-interest. It means loving your enemies, forgiving endlessly, and trusting even when life is uncertain. It is a path that defies human instinct, yet promises the deepest fulfillment. This call is radical because it demands commitment. Jesus did not invite half-hearted participation. He said that following him might require sacrifice, leaving possessions, reputations, and even relationships behind. Yet paradoxically, in surrendering these things, followers gain life in its fullest sense. What is given up is replaced by peace, purpose, and an eternal perspective that the world cannot offer. Jesus' own life illustrates this call. He left comfort, walked among the marginalized, confronted the powerful, and ultimately gave his life for the sake of others. Every action reflected the teachings he shared: love above all, trust over fear, mercy over condemnation. Following him is not about mimicking actions alone. It is about aligning the heart with this vision. The call to follow also unites every teaching we've explored: loving God and neighbor, humility, mercy, generosity, faith, forgiveness, and trust. Each principle is not separate. They are threads woven into the fabric of a life fully surrendered to God's way. Ignoring any one diminishes the wholeness Jesus offers. Even today, this call remains challenging. Modern life prioritizes independence, comfort, and control. Yet Jesus' invitation promises a deeper freedom. Freedom from fear, greed, pride, and anxiety. It offers a life marked not by temporary gain, but by lasting significance. Ultimately, following Jesus is not about restriction, it is about liberation. It is the courageous choice to live with purpose, love without condition, and trust without reservation. It is a life that is fully surrendered, yet paradoxically fully alive. As we reflect on the 20 teachings of Jesus, the thread is clear. Transformation begins in the heart and flows outward. Following him changes not only individual lives, but the world. This is the enduring power of his message, the call to live differently, love radically, and pursue a life that echoes through eternity.